I want to continue our journey in Matthew's Gospel, and we're in the middle of chapter 2. I shared with you in our last episode about the journey of the wise men going from the ends of the earth to find the King of the Jews. I have to take up at a very, very important point, and so I hope you listened to us last time. And that is, what did they find? They made this journey from the ends of the earth. They went looking for the King of the Jews, but what exactly did they find? Matthew says, and going into the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and falling on their knees, they did him homage. And then opening their treasures, they offered him various gifts. They went into the house. Mary and Joseph had been staying in a house in Bethlehem for some months at this particular stage, and the star guided these men directly to this house. That means that they were divinely guided to find this particular house and this particular family. The first question I want to ask and answer is, where was Joseph? At the time, Joseph, of course, was there, but he is not being pointed out by Matthew because Matthew wants to show you a particular image. And the image is a child and his mother, or I can put it the other way around, the king and his Jebura, his great lady. That's a very important thing. Maybe you've never heard the expression the Jebura before, and I'm going to explain it to you. Back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, when God gave the proto-gospel for the first time, he said that the solution to the problems of the human race lay in a king and his mother. Now, the king and his mother, or the child and his mother, are actually the same thing. This was so important that the scholars were very interested in the promise of the book of Samuel, chapter 7, verse 14, 1 Samuel 7:14, about the virgin giving birth, because they said, this is the child and his mother, this is the king and his mother. Now, you know that in the 9th century before Christ, that the people of Israel divided up into two kingdoms. The southern kingdom, they called the kingdom of Judah, and that's where the Judeans lived, and that's where the name the Jews comes from. And the northern part was called, originally it was called Ephraim, but then it became known as the northern kingdom of Israel. The northern kingdom of Israel apostatized from the faith, and they went very worldly, and they lived their lives according to very worldly standards. In Judah, you have about 19 kings reigning in Judah before they eventually go out into Babylon. And you can check this out in the Bible yourself. It's a good thing to look for. Only in the kingdom of Judah, but not in the northern kingdom of Israel, do you find that the king's wife was never called a queen. The person who was honored was the king's mother, and she was called the great Jebura. Now, that in English would be the great lady, or we would say, in America, they'd say the first lady, okay? And it was the king's mother. And so they kept this memory of the king and his mother going all down the centuries, right to the time of they're going into Babylon. And so when these men find the child and his mother, what Matthew is saying is, I've already told you that this child is the King of the Jews. I've already told you he's a son of Abraham, that he's a son of Mary, he's a son of David. I've already told you he's the Messiah. I've already told you he's the Emmanuel. This is who they found. They found the person that the Judean kings have been looking for all down the centuries. They have found him. And the only reason why they don't mention Joseph is to keep the image of the mother, the king and his mother very much alive in the consciousness of the people who are actually reading the text and learning from it. They want us to know. Now, Matthew wanted the Jews in his audience to know this as well, because this would answer one of the major questions that they had. The other thing that Matthew wants to say, that's before I ever mention any gifts, is that as you go through the early part of the gospel and the later sections of the gospel, that is the foundation and the roof of his gospel. Do you remember I told you it was a temple with 5 pillars and then there's a roof? It's at the beginning and at the end that you get an enormous amount of testimony to who Jesus is. And in chapter 2, the heavens proclaim his glory by pointing out through the star that he is born. And the heavens guide these wise people to find Jesus. The second thing is that the scriptures testify to him. Now, each one of the gospels tell us that the scriptures testify to Jesus all the time. And so Matthew goes to the trouble of actually naming it. So one of them was Micah 5:1 that I mentioned before. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you will come the leader who will shepherd my people Israel. So there's the heavens proclaiming his glory, and there's the scriptures proclaiming who he is as well. A third set of testimony is actually set up, and that is these wise men who came from the east who will go back and tell everybody what they have seen. So there is a fourth one I was going to miss, of course, and that is the angel of the Lord who appears to them and tells them, this is what you do and this is what you don't do. Don't go back to Herod. Don't do that. Go on, go home. Tell your good people at home. And so the incredible thing that Matthew is saying is that the gospel message about Jesus Christ got out to the Gentiles long before the Jews knew about it. Because these magi go back into the Middle East where they live, whatever countries they came from. They may not have been from one country. They go back and they proclaim the message. Now, I did say to you earlier when I was introducing the gospel that long before Peter and Paul ever got to Rome, the Christian message got to Rome and Rome was evangelized just by ordinary little people, unnamed people. And that's the way God works, nice and quietly. And he doesn't need any huge, big projects, and he doesn't need the big politicians doing their big gestures. He doesn't need that at all. But these men who came seeking, they actually found what the Jews had been searching for so long, which the Jews themselves didn't find. Okay. So I want to give you another text, which is the scriptures proclaiming Jesus, and it's Genesis 49:10. It says that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the mace from between his feet, until Shiloh, the peaceful one, comes, to whom it belongs, and to him the peoples will render obedience. Now that's as clear as anything in the book of Genesis, and yet the people of Israel couldn't take it. That while the scepter was not going to depart from Judah until the one who owned it would take it, and that person is Jesus. And at the same time, it was the Gentiles who were going to render him obedience, not anybody else. Isn't that amazing? And so the scriptures are fulfilled in amazing detail. So then Matthew tells us that the wise men offered Jesus, and I deliberately mean that, Jesus, not his mother. They offered Jesus some gifts, and one was gold representing divinity, the other was frankincense representing priesthood, and myrrh representing suffering. And so they gave him gifts that told him that we actually knew who you were before we came. If we didn't know, how could we bring you the gifts that speak so much about the mystery of your person? as the Magi approach Bethlehem, a most wonderful text in Isaiah is fulfilled. Listen to this. It's Isaiah chapter 60, verses 1 and 2. Arise, shine out, for your light has come. The glory of the Lord is rising on you. Now, the glory of the Lord rose on these men who were seeking God and guided them the whole way. You find that also in Bethlehem with the shepherds. Luke tells you about that the glory of the Lord rose over them as well. Though night still covers the earth, that's the night of sin and idolatry and unbelief, and darkness still covers the people, above you the Lord now rises. And they saw that rising as the star that rose over them. And above you his glory appears. The nations come to your light, and the kings to your dawning brightness. Lift up your eyes and look around. They're all assembling and coming towards you. And then they begin what I have told you already, the great, great pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So listen to this. They start bringing your sons from far away and your daughters being tenderly carried. At this sight you will grow radiant, your heart throbbing and full, since the riches of Arabia will flow to you and the wealth of the nations will come to you, and so on and so on. It's a big, long look at the rest of the chapter 60 of Isaiah. It's all fulfilled. It's the most amazing thing. But the people who discover its fulfillment are the pure in heart that see God. You'll find that in Matthew 5:8. And the people who are truly seeking God with sincerity. So the Sanhedrin, who are doing their own thing and who have really descended into worldly politics, and Herod, who is just a killer looking after himself, they don't see anything. They don't see anything. They're blind. And so this is the tragedy that you meet with in the gospel. The little people are the ones who find, because the little people are truly seeking God. Now, you think the drama is over? The drama is only beginning. So, the angel of the Lord guides these wise people to go home. And one of the things that Matthew wants you to hear is that only the wise people of any generation ever go seeking God. The foolish ones don't seek him. And you're going to have a parable off at the other end of the gospel of the wise and foolish virgins, representing the whole of God's people. And he divides them into two, the wise and the foolish, those who seek God and follow him and do his will, and those who do their own thing, get lost in the history of the world. And it's our own choice which group we join. So as soon as the wise men go back to their own countries, Herod, of course, realizes that these men were not as stupid as he thought they were. And so when he realizes that they don't come back to him, now don't forget that Bethlehem is only about 2 or 2.5 miles from Jerusalem. You can walk it in no problem. So Herod realizes they should be back by now, and they're not back. And it's several days and they're not back. These people are not going to be staying in a no-place place all of this length of time. And he puts out his spies and realizes these guys have gone. And so at that stage, his murderous intent towards Jesus comes into effect. And unfortunately, we have put traditional titles over all of these texts. And in the Bible, I'm looking at the Jerusalem Bible, it calls it the flight into Egypt and the massacre of the innocents. What they should have said was the cross over the crib. The passion of Jesus has begun. The world rejects him, wants to destroy him, and thinks it can extinguish the light. But that's not going to be allowed to happen at the very beginning. So Jesus has two fathers. He has Joseph on earth, standing in the shoes of his own father in heaven. And both fathers decide they're going to save this son. And so the father of the child gets the message to Joseph to take the son into safety. This is actually very important, because it is only the Father who can reveal who the Son is, and it's only the Father who can protect him, nobody else. And so the message is given to Joseph, take the child and his mother and go. Go to Egypt. Go to Egypt means outside of Herod's territory. That's actually what he was saying. And since Egypt was the place that Jewish people who were in trouble always ran to Egypt, when you're reading the Bible, you mightn't think that. But there was always colonies of Jewish people in Egypt. And it was the place of refuge for when they were in trouble. So Mary and Joseph went there as well. You have here that at the beginning of Jesus' life, the Father will intervene to save his Son from death. At the end of his life, the Father will not intervene to save his Son, even when Jesus is in agony and says, Father, if it is possible, let this chalice pass. The Father doesn't move. And the Father actually wants the Son to make the sacrifice of his life so that the rest of us will be saved. So there's a great difference at the beginning and at the ending, because the Father saves him now so that he is there to give that great sacrifice in the end. God will only protect you when it is the right thing to do. He will only ever do the right thing. He'll only let you off the hook when it's the right thing to do. Take a little tiny trip into the scriptures for a second. Egypt. Genesis 12, Abraham brought his wife Sarah into Egypt at a time of famine. Genesis 37, Joseph, the beloved son of Jacob, was taken to Egypt, but unfortunately as an abused person, as a prisoner. Genesis 46, Jacob and his entire family went down into Egypt, and that's where they actually became a nation. So in the beginning of the book of Exodus, you're told that God called his son out of Egypt, and his son was the whole nation of Israel. And here in chapter 2 of Matthew, Matthew is trying to tell you that Jesus, who is God's actual son, meaning that God is responsible for his coming into existence. And God had to create an incredible miracle in Mary's womb to bring Jesus into existence, because Mary is female and was not capable of giving the Y chromosome to make a man. She was not capable of it. It's not given to women. And so God had to create an incredible miracle, A, to create Jesus, and B, to make him male, so that it was entirely his work, okay? And what people don't realize is that the entire history of Israel is encapsulated in Jesus' life. And he has to identify with all the bad as well as all the good, because he has come to redeem it all. He's come to renew and to cleanse and to purify and to start all over again. This is God's actual son is going to be called out of Egypt, but he's only had to spend about 2 years in Egypt, because he doesn't have to spend the full length of time in order to just cover it. He just has to go. And that's why Matthew says to us in verse 15, yes, in the book of Numbers 23, it says, I've called my son out of Egypt, okay? So it's the angel of the Lord who tells Joseph again when it is the right time. And Joseph is one of the saints that we need to recover. Because I believe that to go into a new phase of the church's life, we need to recover St. Joseph. He lived under exact obedience to God's will. And when you read John's Gospel, you hear Jesus saying, I only ever do what my Father tells me to do. I want the world to know that I love the Father, and therefore I do exactly what my Father tells me. He got a very good model in Joseph. Joseph went to Egypt for no other reason that the Lord told him to go. He stayed for the length of time God wanted him to stay. And when God said, get up and go, he got up and he went. Now, the trouble and the difficulty and the pain and the poverty and everything that went with that, Joseph took it all in his stride. He was a man for God. He's a most wonderful saint. But then you're brought back to Israel, now that the child and his mother are safe because of the two fathers. You're brought back to this horrendous situation in which Herod was so furious that to make absolutely certain he would get the child who was going to be called the King of the Jews, he'd kill every boy. In Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem is a small town, and the number of women who would have had children under the age of 2 might have been 10 or 15, but it's still 10 and 15. And he kills everyone to get to him. But there's a mystery involved here, and that is that at the beginning of Jesus' life, the very first people who get the message that anyone who is to follow him, Jesus will teach it in chapter 16, must take up their cross and follow him. It's a line of martyrs' blood that follows Jesus. And the martyrs' blood has gone on for the last 2,000 years. In the 20th century alone, more martyrs died for Jesus Christ than in the 19 centuries added together before it. And so the testimony of giving your life for Christ. Now, these innocents didn't know what was happening to them, but they are taken by God as very innocent victims. And so they will make reparation for all the sins of the people. And they are also a prophetic forecast that you will find at the other end of the gospel, that the innocent one, who is declared innocent by all the people who accuse him and his executioner, that the innocent one will lay down his life to save all the children that ever were born since the time of Adam. And the thing is wrapped up, that everything has a meaning in God's eyes. Everything is precious. The place of these children is actually very important in the whole story. Thank you for listening. Slán agus banach dé live. Goodbye. God bless you.